So last week, we gave an introduction about the three kinds of people. There's a tzaddik. This is based on the Talmud, which is the oral tradition. There is the tzaddik, the righteous one, who is ruled by his good inclination. We have the rasha, which is the wicked one, who is ruled by his evil inclination. And then we have the Beinoni, which is the intermediate one, who is ruled by both his animal and godly soul, as we explained last week, and we will continue to elaborate. So again, we explained the difference and how Tanya, the book of Tanya, written by the first Chabad Rebbe, explains these three types of people, the tzaddik, the rasha, the Beinoni, that the tzaddik is the one who not only behaves righteously, but he is righteous. He has no temptation for evil. Now, most of us cannot even imagine what it would mean that someone should have no temptation at all for evil. Because most human beings that we've encountered, vast majority of human beings that we've encountered, have temptation. The rasha is the one who has temptation and acts on it. Of course, there are different levels, and as we explained last week, that there are people who are a very high level of a rasha, which means rasha means wicked. But wicked means someone who falls to temptation. It doesn't mean the wicked in the conventional use of the word, which is, so to speak, a borrowed term, which is someone who's wicked. But wicked, rasha means someone who has temptation and falls. He acts on his temptation. The Beinoni is a hybrid of the tzaddik and the rasha. So that's the third category. In his heart, he is the intermediate one. What does it mean he's intermediate? So he is like the rasha, as he may possess a desire for evil, which means he is a human being, like you and me, most of us, I should say, that has desire for lusts and desire for materialism, for physical things, for things that are not godly, for things that are inappropriate, perhaps. He's a normal person. However, what is his advantage? Why is he called the intermediate? Because on the other hand, he is also like the tzaddik. What does it mean he's like a tzaddik? The tzaddik never acts. The tzaddik never acts on an evil impulse because he doesn't have an evil impulse. So he never acts on it. The tzaddik is completely holy. He's completely righteous. The rasha, the Beinoni, on the other hand, the Beinoni, he does have desire and lust. However, like a tzaddik, he doesn't actually act on it. So Rabbi Grona was one of the Rebbe's personal assistants. He actually passed away, unfortunately, around Pesach time from Corona. And I remember he came to visit his brother in Australia, and he farbranged for us there. And he spoke to us, he told us, I think it was a 5-hour farbrangen or more through the night. It was 100 years since the Chabad Lubavitch Yeshiva was first established. So this was about 20 plus years ago, or 23 years ago. And so he farbranged for us through the night, many, many hours. And one of the things I remember that he spoke to us about, he was talking to yeshiva students, and he was explaining to us that having a desire for something material or even a lust is normal. It's a normal thing, especially in a teenager, a young adult. Sometimes you'll see something that causes the heart to become a little excited. He said, that's not a problem. You see, a Beinoni can have that. He says, the problem is when we don't have self-control. And he gave an example. And he said, if a person's walking down the street and a person sees something that can cause negative thoughts or influence a person in negative behavior, so the moment you saw that and it created a little bit of a feeling, he said, that's okay. It's the moment you turn around and you give it a second look and you pay attention to it and you continue to think about it and you can't control yourself to stop that thought, that's when the problem is. So realizing that on the one hand, we could be human. It's human to have lust and to have desire and to be drawn to physical things, some things less dangerous, some things more dangerous. It's very normal. And it's important that we teach our children and youngsters that it's normal to have desire and so on. However, the problem is where we act on it, where we continue, as we'll see. There are garments of the soul that we're going to learn about today, which include thought, speech, and action. And when a person thinks, which means continues to have thoughts and doesn't put a stop to a thought that is a negative thought, or starts to speak about a thought which is something negative, and how much more so acts with something without self-control, that's where the problem becomes. And so when a person takes that lust, the desire, and translates it into action, or into thought, into speech, or into action, that is already the level of a rasha. Now, a rasha doesn't mean that you did the worst sin in the world, but if you don't have control over your desire, that is already, according to Kabbalah, that is already considered a level of a rasha. Our goal is to try to every day have more control over ourselves, and even on little things, because little things we know build up. So if a person has a desire for something very small, it could be for ice cream, and the moment that person sees ice cream, they buy it and eat it, or take it out the freezer and eat it, and they have no control. And they can't tell themselves that I'm not going to eat it. I'll only eat it for a special time. Or if the ice cream controls us, or the thought about ice cream controls us, that is something that we are able to work on and to be able to control ourselves. And that's something that we should learn to control ourselves, because as we spoke about last week, we have the ability as a human being, we have the ability to overcome, to be in control of ourselves, and not that our outside influence should have control over us. And that's really what we're talking about here. So again, we have three different kinds of people. The top of the line would be the tzaddik. You would then have the bottom, which would be the rasha, who has no control. And the Beinoni is the person who's trying to learn how to gain control. Now, ultimately, the Beinoni is someone who has already gained that control. But most of us, are between that Beinoni. We're not at the tzaddik level. We're not at the low level of a rasha. We're somewhere between the Beinoni and the rasha. And we're trying to build ourselves up and trying to gain control. And the more control that we have, the closer we are to that Beinoni. So that's three levels of a person. The next thing that we're talking about is also three things, which are the three garments of the soul. And that's what this class is titled, The Garments of the Soul. Now, the garments of the soul, and we'll talk a little bit more about them today, are thought, speech, and action. Those are the garments of the soul, and we'll explain why they're called the garments of the soul. So this is just a quick review, the difference between the tzaddik and the Beinoni, as we quoted from the verse in Genesis, where Yitzchak, in the story where Yitzchak tells Esau, Isaac tells Esau to make for me delicacies such as I love. that this is really the Torah talks in terms of this world, but is really a reference to something much more spiritual. As we know, and I may have mentioned this last week, that everything has a body and a soul. When you read the simple story of the Torah, make for me delicacy such as I love, which is Isaac talking to Esau, that's the body of the Torah. The soul of the Torah is a deeper dimension, where I recognize that it's not only Isaac talking to Esau, but it's the divine presence talking to all of us and saying to us that there are two types of delicacies that the divine likes. One type of delicacy is the delicacies that a tzaddik brings to the table, the righteous brings to the table, is the tasks of sweetness and light, and we'll talk about them more today. And the Beinoni, which is the intermediate, which struggles with bitterness and darkness. And most human beings have within them a struggle of bitterness and darkness, of challenge, inner challenge, and struggle in different areas, and no two people are alike, which is why many times when we'll hear a struggle about another person, we'll immediately say, oh, that's terrible, because we can't imagine struggling with that area. But our own struggles, we can imagine. So if someone has the same struggle as us, it's much easier to justify it. So what we really are trying to do is, what we have to try to do is to have self-reflection and to realize, what are my true struggles? Now, my struggles may not be as evil, as negative as another person's. However, I still struggle. And my job is to overcome those struggles and to become a better person. And that's the Beinoni. We also discussed last week the two biblical tales. Story number one was the story of Moses, how Moses sent spies, and how Moses had asked God if he could send spies. And God said, send them according to your own heart. Only if you wish, you could send them, but I'm not going to command them. I'm not going to command you to send them. And so here we saw, and then there's a second story that we spoke about where story number two, after Moses passes away, Joshua sends spies to Jericho. And their report is that the nations are trembling, and then the Jewish people conquer the land. So we saw two differences, which we're going to review now, two differences between the story of Moses and Joshua, which we went through last week. Number one difference is that with Moses 40 years earlier, God said it was optional, send if you wish. Whereas with Joshua, it was a command. And number two is that when it came to Moses in the spies went to spy out the entire land of Canaan, whereas the Joshua, he only sent to Jericho. And we went more in depth into both of these stories, but I just want to recap so we can continue. So as I said, that every part of Torah, every story of Torah, of the biblical Torah stories, have within them a body, which is the plain, simple meaning. But they also have a spiritual manifestation and a lesson for each of us. Otherwise, why would we be commanded to study the stories? To know what happened in history? Yes, there's value to knowing what happened in history. But if we can't learn from history, then what's the value? So the idea of the Torah is not to teach us what happened as much as to teach us how to behave. And so every part of Torah teaches us has the soul of Torah. The soul of Torah teaches us how to behave, how we have to behave from a soul perspective. And so we move beyond the physical manifestation of the story to its eternal spiritual manifestation, in which man sends spies. Each and every one of us are supposed to send spies to assess and conquer Canaan. Canaan is the body and the animal soul, and we are supposed to transform it, and that's what the Jewish people did. They transformed Canaan into the land of Israel, and what we have to do is to transform our animal soul, our body, into holiness, and that is the land of Israel. So we have to send spies, we have to assess, we have to conquer. Now that we've gone through the stories, we can understand how it relates. Let's have a look at Jericho. So this is where we got to last week, and I added a picture of a suit or garments, and that's what we want to discuss today. Jericho, the city of Jericho represents our behavior. It represents the garments of the soul. The garments of the soul, as I mentioned, are thought, speech, and deed. The name Jericho in Hebrew is Yericho. Yericho comes from the root word reach. Reach means a scent. And so when we talk about the garments of our soul, there are two parts. We connect the garments of our soul to mitzvot. Now, there are three kinds of mitzvot. There are mitzvot that we do in our thought, right? Like Torah study. There are mitzvahs that are articulated in speech. And there are mitzvot that are done in action. All mitzvot, whether in thought, speech, and action, are likened to garments and also likened to scent. And garments of the soul are related to scent. And therefore, when we look at Jericho from a spiritual perspective, we look at Jericho. Jericho is the ultimate scent. It's the garment of the soul. And that's why it's right before you enter into the land itself. Before you enter the soul itself, what comes first is the garment. So mitzvahs are garments of the soul for the afterlife. That's one way of understanding it. Like a scent, mitzvot are an effusion from the divine light. So they are garments for the soul every time a person does a mitzvah. These mitzvot become garments for your soul. They protect your soul. They elevate your soul. And they also mitzvot, because where does a mitzvah come from? It comes from God. They have a good scent for the soul, and they create a scent, a beautiful smell for the soul. The second point is, and why we talk about garments and scent when it comes to the thought, speech, and action of the soul, is because mitzvot, like garments, are outside and beyond the soul. Just like a garment, the garment sits beyond us, it's on top of us, it's over us, it covers us, it encompasses us. So too the soul, the mitzvot encompass the soul. And secondly, in that part as well, related to scent, mitzvot are intangible and cannot be grasped like a scent. You see, there is the mitzvah which you could grasp, which is the physical mitzvah. You're lighting the Shabbat candles, you're putting on the tefillin, you're giving charity. That's a physical mitzvah. But every mitzvah has within it a spiritual part, an energy. And that energy is intangible, like a scent. So the mitzvot creates, every mitzvah has within it a tremendous scent, a special smell. And every mitzvah becomes like a garment for the soul. And so thought, speech, and action are the way we actually fulfill a mitzvah. And so the thought, speech, and action are considered the garments and scent of the soul. Our job, which is the work of a Beinoni, or those aspiring to be that intermediate person, our job is to try to influence our thoughts, speech, and action, and try to influence them with thoughts of Torah, thoughts of kindness, thoughts of mitzvot, speech, words of goodness, encouraging words, positive words, words of Torah, words of praise, all mitzvot that are related to thought, all mitzvot that are related to speech, and all mitzvot that are related to action. And when we do, we create a garment for our soul, and we also create a scent for our soul. So mitzvot are beautiful, beautiful thing, beyond what we could see. And they create a beautiful, beautiful scent and garment for our soul. The Zohar tells us the following very interesting story. The Zohar tells a story as follows, that Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Judah stayed at the home, these were Talmudic sages. They stayed at the home of the wife of Rabbi Hamnuna, the elder. She was the mother of an especially gifted child, known in the Zohar, in Kabbalistic works of the Zohar, who, by the way, the Zohar was written by a sage, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, or the teachings of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, who his students actually wrote it. But that child was known in the Zohar as the Yenuka. Yenuka is a very gifted child, spiritual person, who is extremely sensitive. You know, it's interesting that two people could be sitting eating breakfast, cereal, just use a simple example. Two people eating cereal, one finishes off the bowl, no problem, and the second one takes one spoonful and says, "Ooh, the milk is on its way out." Why? What happened to the first person? It's very simple. We all understand this is not major science. Different people are sensitive, different than others, right? So some people are very sensitive to taste. Some people are very sensitive to smell. Some people are very sensitive to feeling. And some people even have a sense of very sensitive to their surroundings. Which is why we all have this. We all have a sense of this in a very different, in a very real way. And I'll give you an example. But just give me 1 second. I just want to get myself a drink. I forgot to bring a glass of water to the table. So give me 1 second, please. Can you? Here, one. Thank you. Okay. So we all have this example. We make a bracha, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol niyah b'dvarei. We all have sensitivity to different things. And one example would be where you had a feeling of something strange, and then you got a phone call of the strangest thing. Or you were thinking about someone, which is very common, and then the person called you a minute later. How often does that happen? It happens often. We all have that. Where at different times in our lives. Or how many times I call people and people tell me, "Rabbi, 5 minutes ago, how did you know? We were just talking about you." The question is not how I knew. People think I'm the great tzaddik that I called them 5 minutes after they were speaking. I think it's the other way around. The ones who were speaking about me, they had intuition that there was a connection. They felt it first. That's why they were speaking about me first. So we all have it in a different way. And the reason why I say this is because we can appreciate the story better. Understanding that if we feel our environment in different ways, and we all are different in sensitivity, we can certainly appreciate that spiritually, there are people who are able to feel and be sensitive to things, to spirituality, on a way that we perhaps cannot. So here's the story. So this child was an especially gifted child, and the mother said that he should go to these great men, these great sages who have come to stay over and receive blessing from them. So he went towards them, and as he went towards them, he started to back off. He drew back. Says, and he said to his mother, I do not want to go near them because they did not recite the Shema today. I don't want to approach these great sages because they didn't recite the Shema. There's a mitzvah in the Torah to recite the Shema twice daily, in the morning and the evening. Apparently, they hadn't recited the Shema. The rabbis admitted this to be true, explaining that they had been busy with the mitzvah of helping a groom and bride. But they asked this boy, how did you know? And the boy answered, from the scent of your garments. Now, obviously, he wasn't talking about the scent of their physical garments. Their shirts did not smell because they lacked Shema, saying the Shema. Nevertheless, he was sensitive to their spiritual garments. And that's something that he was able to sense, that there was something missing. And so every mitzvah that we do, we accomplish in an incredible way. We create spiritual energy. We create a scent. We create garments that have a powerful impact on a deeper dimension of our soul. And we should realize that although we cannot smell it and we're not sensitive to it, there are people who are sensitive. But forget those other people. Our souls are sensitive. And our souls appreciate when we do a mitzvah. When we do a mitzvah of charity. When we do a mitzvah of Ahavat Yisrael, of love for another person. When we help another person. When we visit the sick. When we visit a mourner. Where we put on tefillin, study Torah, put on a mezuzah on our door. Every one of these mitzvot have a powerful effect on our soul, and we can't necessarily know or feel it because we aren't so sensitive to it. When I was reading this and preparing this concept, I remembered that just yesterday, in one of the WhatsApp groups, I'm on a couple WhatsApp groups, mostly family, but there's one WhatsApp group that I check once in the morning and once in the evening. Sometimes if I have a quiet minute during the day, because it's a teacher of mine from many years ago who posts every day stories of inspiration. Most times it's written text, and sometimes it's a video message that he finds inspiring. And so the following story came in. I have to actually stop my share. I'm going to re-share again in a second because I have to make sure that there's sound. But the following story, that the sound, by the way, of this story might not be so loud. So if it's quiet, you should be able to hear it. But if it's on the quiet end, forgive me because it came off. I downloaded it, so it's a very low file. But it's a beautiful story that, sometimes when you tell a story over, it doesn't have the same thing when you hear it the first time or from the person who knew it firsthand. So this story is told by Rabbi Manis Friedman, who is a very well-known speaker, a world-renowned speaker, Rabbi Manis Friedman. He's a Chabadnik, lives in Minnesota, teaches Bali Tshuva girls who are coming closer to their roots, to Yiddishkeit. But he also speaks throughout all over the world. So Rabbi Manis Friedman shares the following story about his father. And if you want to appreciate this story, now that we've spoken about the sensitivities that some people have towards spirituality, I think we could appreciate this story.
I'll tell you a quick story. My father was imprisoned by the communists in Czechoslovakia for smuggling Jews out of communist countries. And while he was in prison, he vowed that if he got out, which was not guaranteed, if he got out, he would say a certain amount of Tehillim every day. And he did all his life. One day, it was a winter day, there was a fire at the yeshiva building. My father was in charge of the building. And he woke up very early, rushed out there to see what's going on, had to deal with the police, it was arson, there was a fire department, the insurance. By the time he got home, it was late. He quickly davened and went to sleep. He didn't say the Tehillim that day for the first time in many years. Anyway, he had written to the Rebbe about buying a house in Crown Heights. That night, he got an answer from the Rebbe with a blessing to buy the house. And at the bottom of the page, the Rebbe wrote, Tehillim, ?
Oh my gosh.
It seems that the Tehillim that he hadn't said that day left a blank space, someplace in heaven, where it was supposed to be, and the Rebbe felt it. Where is your Tehillim?
Were you able to hear it? So now we can appreciate, people ask, the Rebbe was able to send certain things, and give blessings. God gifts us all in different ways. And as I said, we all are sensitive to different things, most of us materialistic things, but even a little bit more sensitive to spirituality. And there are people who are far more sensitive than we are. And in that way, the Rebbe had felt somehow that the Tehillim of Rabbi Manis Friedman's father was not recited that very day. So we know that our mitzvahs that we do, and that's a good story, because that reminds us that the mitzvahs that we do have a real impact in the spiritual worlds. So Joshua's mission, which is to go to Jericho. Jericho is the scent, which represents the garments and the smell of the soul, which is the thought, speech, and action, is an unqualified commandment for everyone, since the conquest of Jericho, which is one's behavior, lies in the reach of every human being. Every single one of us is able to take control. Now, maybe not right away over all of it, and maybe never over all of it, but we are all able to grow in that self-control. In other words, only our garments are in our control. And so here there is a commandment for each of us to scout out and examine our thought, speech, and deed and ensure that they are the way they should be. How do we accomplish this? How do we become in control of our thought, speech, and action? And so this Hasidic discourse, this Hasidic essay continues, and it explains that by restraining ourselves when we have cravings for material pleasures, and by controlling the drive of one's heart, of one's heart's lust, by not allowing it to find expression in deed, speech, and even thought, to the extent we can divert our mind, that we are able to do. We are able to become in complete control. We can control when we eat, when we do when we have physical pleasures, when we do certain things. We are able to be in control of ourselves. The only question is, how are we going to accomplish that? And we accomplish that, as we will soon see, through meditation, which means you can't just tell yourself, I'm going to be in control. Okay, that's it. From today on, I'm in control of my thoughts, speech, and action. Doesn't work that way. It's not so easy, right? So a person has to have meditation, and we'll talk a little bit, hopefully if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about the meditation that we need to do in order to, but the goal here, the goal, which is a reachable goal, is that we should all be able to have control, self-control. And I think that's all something that we all want to have, ultimately, to have self-control. When am I going to pick up my cell phone? When am I going to go to the refrigerator? When am I going to do whatever I do? Not that it's bad to go to the refrigerator, not that it's bad to pick up my cell phone. But if I don't have self-control, then there are areas in my life where I need to have self-control, and I would never have practiced it. So I want to practice it in every area. And I want to be a master over my thought, speech, and deed. And if I'm able to master, be master, a master being a master over my thought, speech, and deed, then I can now aspire to become that Beinoni, at least grow towards that Beinoni and further away from that level of a Rasha, the lowest level. However, we also know that while we had the story, the story of Joshua relates to all of us, because Joshua's story was about the garments that we can all have control over. We know there is also a story about Canaan, and the Jewish people conquered Canaan. But we talk about Moses sending spies to Canaan. It wasn't a commandment, and we'll see why. Because Canaan represents the human psyche, man's emotions. We know that the land of Israel was this land of the 7 nations, which represents the 7 emotions. 7 nations, 7 emotions. Now, for us to be in complete control over our emotions, that's something that's not possible for us. Meaning, to control how we express that emotion. Which means if I'm upset about something, if I should think about the anger and let that anger build in my mind, express that anger with my words, and express that anger with my actions, that's something that I can become in control of. But whether or not something's going to get me upset, that's a level of a tzaddik. You know, often we say, I'm not going to let myself get upset over it. Haha, you already got upset over it. The fact that you have to tell yourself, I'm not going to get upset over it, is because you already got upset over it. But it's true, but it's good to say, I'm not going to get upset over it. What does it mean, I'm not going to get upset over it? I can't control my emotions to get upset over something when there's a reason to get upset. But for me to think about and develop that anger in my mind, and more so in my thought, in my speech, and in my behavior, that's something that I have control. If I start to feel a love to something, right? I really want that ice cream. Okay, because it looks so good. The fact that I really wanted it for a moment is not a bad thing, and that I can't control. Some things I like, some things I don't. But if I cannot control myself, how long I should think about the ice cream, or whether or not I'm going to actually ask someone to get it for me, or control myself if I'm going to actually eat it, that is something that I have, that's the Beinoni. So the tzaddik, if you told him, it says about Hillel was one of the great sages. And he said he was a tremendous, tremendous patient person. No one was ever able to get him angry. He was a tzaddik. You couldn't get him angry. He would get upset maybe from something. I'm sure there was some area, because emotion, if you're upset, I mentioned this last week, that if we have an emotion for, let's say someone did something bad, negative to the Jewish people, that's not a bad thing, right? So, but that comes from a good place. That comes from your godly soul. There's emotions, right? It's not to get rid of our emotions. We're here, what we're trying to do is transform our emotions. That emotions should be motivated by only good things, or by only, not for self-interest, right? So a tzaddik will get angry at someone who, let's say we were in a place where someone shouted Jew. So a tzaddik would be upset for the Jewish people. Someone like you and me would be upset for ourselves. We'd be angry ourselves because the guy hurt me. It's a very different thing. One's coming from a godly place and one's coming from a selfish place. That's the difference. So ultimately, our goal is not to be complete, to transform our 7 emotions that we should never get angry or never love, and from an animalistic place that I should never love ice cream. There's nothing wrong with that. That's human nature. And unless someone is a real tzaddik, you're not going to be able to break that. What we're trying to do is to gain control through the garments of the soul. And the garments of the soul should be complete. The tzaddik, on the other hand, since he doesn't have the struggles that most others have, he primarily involves himself with the emotions of the heart. So he is working with the emotions of the heart. He is not working with what's the emotions of the heart. The emotions of the heart, the love and fear of God, and that's what he spends his time doing, building and enriching the garment, the soul itself, which is emotions, the emotions of the soul. Whereas the Beinani, the rest of us, our job is to work on thought, speech, and action. So Moses' mission to spy out the entire land, to examine and sanctify the emotions, was not commanded by God, since not everybody can fulfill it. Only Moses, or those on his spiritual level, who are on the level of a tzaddik, they can aspire to it. They could become in control and transform the emotions. Shlach lecha, send for yourself according to your judgment, because only Moses and people on Moses' level are able to transform the emotions. Most of us, we're not able to transform emotions. What we are able to do, and what our goal is, to transform our thought, speech, and action, the garments. Okay, so we're going back to Tanya, the book of Tanya. And the book of Tanya says a very interesting thing. Right at the very beginning, and this is the opening of the book of Tanya, it says, before the soul comes down into this earth, it is charged with an oath. We all made an oath, the Shavua. What was the oath? Be a tzaddik and do not be a rasha. That we should all be a tzaddik and not be a rasha. So the redundancy of this oath is not merely just a word, just to use a word, but suggests a two-pronged message. What is it? Number one, be a tzaddik. Okay, so it says here, be a tzaddik. You have to try to be a tzaddik. And the Alter Rebbe then writes that since most people do not have the potential to become a tzaddik, so that's the second part. The first part is try to be a tzaddik. But since most people cannot be a tzaddik, at least do not be a rasha. What would a rasha be? Someone who has no control over his thought, speech, and action, and does whatever comes. So that the oath that we make is that a person should number one, be a tzaddik. At least try, make every effort to be a tzaddik. And if not, at least try to be a rasha. But the real question here, as the picture sort of suggests, you don't give someone a task that you know they can't fulfill. You just don't give a kid this many shopping boxes in the supermarket. If most of us cannot be a tzaddik, why would they make our soul, why would they make us make an oath before we come into this world that we should be a tzaddik? The second part, that we should be not be a rasha, that I understand, which means you should be a Beinani, right? Be that intermediate guy. Guy has control over his thought, speech, and action. But if we can't have control over our emotions, which is the level of a tzaddik, why give an instruction that you can't fulfill? Does it make any sense to give an instruction that we can't fulfill? How do we understand this? And God we taught that before we come down into this world, the heavenly beings make the soul make an oath. And what's that oath? That it should be a tzaddik. How do we understand that? What's the point of making an oath that we're going to be a tzaddik if it's not within our reach? It doesn't make any sense. And so the Alter Rebbe explains that what it means is that we have to cultivate a tzaddik-like consciousness. What does it mean, a tzaddik-like consciousness? And here's where our meditation comes in. And this is very important for us to meditate. If we want to change our behavior, our thought, speech, and action, we have to meditate. So there are two parts. Part number one is for the Beinani. To make sure that we're not a Rasha, that we're not wicked, we have part number one. In order to be a tzaddik-like, to have the awareness of the awesomeness of Hashem, which is the second part, then we have a different kind of meditation. So there are two different kinds of meditations that we're able to have and we should have. And through that, we are able to have a tzaddik-like consciousness. So first thing is a revulsion for material indulgences. What does that mean? We have a meditation to regulate one's emotion. For example, there are many meditations that we can have. If a person had an immoral desire that he should, then he should meditate about how disgusting and repulsive it is. So if a person has a negative desire for something, and a person wants to be able to have control in thought, speech, and action, so what does one do? One meditates on how lowly, how disgusting and repulsive that desire, not that desire, but the thing is that he has a desire for. So if I know, for example, I'll just give you a simple explanation, okay? A person has celiac, okay? Normal thing today. A person has celiac, or a person has diabetes, and there's certain foods that a person is not allowed to have. And if the person has those foods, then it can cause damage to the person, serious health issues. So how does the person loved ice cream or loved chocolate cake, and they go to parties all the time, and the people bring out chocolate cake. So how does a person tell themselves that I shouldn't want it so I don't feel uncomfortable the whole time? There are many people who can't go to functions where people are serving things that they can't have. I'll give you another example. Someone who perhaps had a challenge with alcohol. Now they can't go to any function where alcohol is being served because they're worried that even if they're not going to have it, that they're going to feel that desire for it the whole time, and it's going to be too difficult for them. So what is the trick, that the meditation that one should have? And with the more we meditate and we do this, we could actually, and any one of you could choose something in your life and try it, and it really works. What do? You have to meditate on the fact that that particular food is actually repulsive. It's disgusting. Think about the germs that might be in it. Any way that you could come to bring yourself to recognize and to come to appreciate that this thing is disgusting, that will help you. So now that when you're seeing this bottle of wine that you shouldn't be having, that bottle of wine is disgusting. I don't want it anyway. They want to have it, they can have it. Now I could comfortably, and it's a very difficult thing, but it is something that we can accomplish through meditation. So instead of staying away, a person can actually meditate and bring themselves to actually dislike something that they cannot have it anymore. Now, for some things it's easy, and for some things it's harder. I tried it on a few things, by the way. And for some things it worked, and for some things it hasn't yet. Okay? And my point is that it doesn't mean I should stop trying, because if I need to, even on simple things, on things that I wanted to take off out of my diet, or simple things, we could train ourselves to see. Now, one of the ways is to think about how all physical pleasures eventually decay. And why would if something is it's decay, and you think about how the physical pleasure doesn't last, all these kind of thoughts that we could have, meditate, not at the time when we have that desire, because then it's too late. Now I have the desire. I can't start telling myself when I have a desire, this thing is disgusting. It has to be before. So that when I come to a place where that thing that I shouldn't be having is there, I could easily tell myself, oh, that thing is disgusting. I don't like it anyway. And I'm not fooling myself. I've taught myself, I've trained myself to feel disgusted by it. And now I will not have that desire for that thing. So that's one example, just an example of pages and pages and many, many different areas of advice on how to meditate to become in control of our physical behavior, of our thought, speech, and action. That's one example. But that's not the tzaddik like. That's getting myself away from the material indulgence. That's the Beinani. That's to live up, to elevate myself from the Rasha to the Beinani. What I really need to do is also the tzaddik like. And the tzaddik like, he's working on his emotions. What is her emotions? To inspire that he should love and fear for God. The awareness of the awesomeness of Hashem. And that's something that we should also meditate on. Even though we're not going to have that love and fear that the tzaddik is going to have in my emotions, the way he's going to have it. Maybe I'll have it. Actually, the Alter Rebbe says that we could have it, but certain times of the day. We may not have it consistently, but we could have it at certain times. Like when we pray on Yom Kippur, I think we all have it. We all have a little sense of a little bit more spirituality, that we suddenly start to feel an awareness of God, a love or a fear, an awe of God. And that comes at different times. So we could achieve it at certain times, but it won't be in control, especially when we're doing physical activity. It won't be something that we are in control of. So number one is what we should be in control of all the time. Number two is something that we should do. And that's why we should do at times. And that's why there are two parts of that oath that the soul takes before it comes down into this world. Number one, be like a tzaddik, which means try to inspire yourself to have that love and fear in your emotions, at least at certain times, like the tzaddik, which is number two. And you should also, at least if you can't reach that full extent of that, of the tzaddik level, which most of us can't, at least you should not be a rasha, and you should aspire to become that Beinani. What are the benefits? So number one, a person will be able, when a person becomes, will accustom himself to a more evil, it will to a small degree become abhorrent in his eyes, as I explained. Also, when he will rejoice in God through meditation, which is the tzaddik level, it will make an impact above. And by the way, it is possible for a part of a soul of a tzaddik to impregnate itself into another person. Which means if we meditate on godliness, it is possible for a part of a soul of a tzaddik to enter within us. This is a Kabbalistic concept I'm not going to get into, but there is a concept of souls traveling. Just like we travel, souls travel. And so souls, there is a person can accomplish that a greater level of a soul, a greater soul can actually come into that person. And that's the way that the oath can be fulfilled, that we should be a tzaddik, a righteous person. So even though I may not be a tzaddik, Moses' mission to spy out the entire land is still relevant to me. Which means, if Joshua represents the Beinani, and I'm the person who's the Beinani, and Moses represents the tzaddik, and I can never reach the level of a tzaddik, so then that whole story seems to be irrelevant to me. How's that story relevant to me? I'm not going to become a tzaddik. So that story of the Torah is relevant, but we know that every story is relevant in the Torah to me and to you, each and every one of us. And so in this way, even though Moses, and I see my spelling mistakes as I'm typing, even though I may not be a tzaddik, Moses' mission to spy out the entire land is still relevant to me by involving myself to some extent in the tzaddik-like service. Here we see how every story in Torah, even those that seem to be beyond us, contain lessons for each of us. So that is, I know it was a deep, deep class, but I think it also had a very practical element. So we learned about the difference between Moses' spies and Joshua's spies. We spoke about the difference between a tzaddik and a Beinani. And the tzaddik is the one who works on his emotions, going into the full land of Israel. The Beinani, which is us, is going to be only into, and I'll take a question in a moment, and give me 1 second, Ira. The Beinoni is going to be only working on his garments of his soul, which is Jericho, but yet we still try to work on that Moses part, which is the love and fear and awe of God. And in this way, the story of Moses is also relevant to us. I'm going to take a question, Ira, but just next week, why is the Beinoni able to control his behavior but not his emotions? How we to understand that? Why can't I become in control of my emotions? Well, we will discover a second thing next week, that the garments actually transcend the soul. You see, when we look at garments, most times we think to ourselves that the garment is secondary to the person. But if you think deeper about a garment, what happens is a garment actually enhances a person. And the same way like a garment enhances a person, the garments of the thought, speech, and action of Torah and mitzvot have the ability to raise the soul to a higher status. Just like when a person puts on garments, if a person puts on royal garments, it can raise that person, help that person raise to a higher status. So to the soul, the garments of the soul. At this time, I'm going to allow some questions.